I'm one of these people called an ergonomist. I've been involved in ergonomics for, I'm beginning to get to the age where I prefer not to know actually, it's more than 30 years. First of all involved in research, have more now, much more moved into a consulting role with Axis Ergonomics. And I also get involved reasonably extensively in expert witness work. I want to touch on some of the research evidence without going into any detail. And I will say at this point, before I forget, just as an example, you may not, because you don't necessarily see the academic style press, there are, for example, two papers which I brought with me. One's in the journal Applied Ergonomics and one's in the journal Ergonomics, which is perhaps surprising as they're ergonomics papers, but that deal with pipette use. So there has been study. So this is not just anecdotal and it's not purely just evidence-based, although a lot of it is. There is also some quite good quality actually coming mainly out of Scandinavia. They're there. Okay. If you look at both a research base and also an anecdotal and an evidence base, you will be able to find this sort of information. But this is generally what you'll find, and if you scan through the ergonomics journals and texts, you'll find that this sort of thing. These are the type of poor outcomes that can result if ergonomics is poor. Ergonomics is a discipline that draws heavily on other disciplines. It draws heavily on the human sciences and engineering, sort of paramedicine, if I can say that, and really brings it all together. But it is fundamentally a systems approach. And it's a user-centered systems approach. So that's, when we're talking about ergonomics, the primary concern is the user in the center of the system. We have to look at the rest of the system, but that's where we are with that. And these are the sort of considerations, therefore, that we need to be making. Characteristics of the users, then we've got the tasks, the environment in which they work, and the equipment that they use. And that, of course, as you will readily identify, is lab ergonomics is entirely in there. That's really it. It's those issues. Let's talk about the risk factors for upper limb disorders. You could actually have these just as easily for back injury because they're virtually identical. It's more to do with the relative severity of each of the factors. So with back injury, you are often looking at larger loads, whereas with an upper limb disorder, you're often looking at smaller loads handled more repetitively. So we have posture. Posture is a key factor. Extreme joint posture, awkward posture, it's a bit of a loose term, and static postures, where you're holding a posture but still doing work, which we're not really built for from a musculoskeletal perspective. Then we have force, which can be both an internal force generated inside the body as a result of an external force. So if you lift a load or you're handling something, you are generating an internal force, but you also have an external force. So we have the two types of forces that are involved. Then we have frequency. How often is the task being carried out? This is sort of the systems approach, really. They all link, of course, because frequency may well have an impact on force and posture, because postures vary during the day. And finally, we have the aspect of duration. For how long is this operation being carried out? And in many ways, that, frankly, is the basis of a risk assessment, an ergonomics risk assessment. Clearly, we have the Health and Safety at Work Act, Safe System of Work, and then the associated six-pack. And I've tried really just to summarise what it means in terms of ergonomics. Remove risk at source, or reduce to the lowest extent, lowest level that's reasonably practical. This applies across display screen, lab work, manufacturing, and so on. Risk assessments and control measures, training and information. Consider the ergonomics of fit is probably more relevant to PPE regs and work equipment regs, where they are specifically mentioned, both in terms of considering ergonomics in the design of equipment and with PPE making the right fit and having different sizes available and so on, which is certainly relevant in this industry, and control the work environment, and of course health surveillance. And one of the reasons I wanted to summarise that was because when we talk about common law duties, of course breach of statutory duty is a relevant issue. Common law duty of care, of course, requires employers to take reasonable care to protect their employees from foreseeable injury or illness, I suppose, as well. Foreseeable is foreseeable by the employer, not by an expert. We have negligence. Breach of statutory duty is, I suppose, pretty obvious. And causation, which I don't get involved in because that's for the medical experts. And what I've tried to do here is to summarise in 4 bullet points how musculoskeletal disorders perhaps can develop, very simply, and the difference between back disorders and upper limb disorders. There was a study done in the 1960s at Cranfield University. It's called the Cranfield Man. It probably should be called the Cranfield Person these days. This was a study done at, as I say, at Cranfield with lathe and milling equipment, noting the sort of an outline of a person and where all the control mechanisms are. And what they basically showed was if you put a man into this system, they should look like this. Because that's their shape and form that they should have to fit the system. Do we have a lab person like a Cranfield person because of some of the equipment that they're being, and I say this carefully, but forced to use? Here's another one. So even with a seat, as you see on the right-hand side, you've got other issues that start to come into play with compression of the thighs. So there's not a fantastic solution here, although there is a solution. Fume cupboards and biosafety cabinets. The stooping, the reaching to the far side. Cupboards underneath, you have no knee access, so you're having to twist. Again, that could be quite fatiguing and potentially injurious over a long period of time. Even with bench work, where you've got a common 900mm bench height, what type of work is being carried on there? In the first instance, you've got this lady who either needs to, or for some reason is choosing to, adopt a poor upper back posture. I mean, all sorts of things come to mind, of course. Are her spectacles right? If she's, I mean, it could be that she's actually wearing safety glasses, but this is the sort of systems approach. What's wrong here? Is it that she needs to sit and there's a chair there? Does she stand because she doesn't want to sit all day, which is actually quite good practice? Is it appropriate to angle the work, or angle the bench, and so on and so forth? Potentially quite simple solutions in inverted commas. But even with sitting, again, we see on the far side, that the right-hand side, there's no knee clearance, so the guy's perching on the edge of the stool. Microscopes, often nowadays with display screen equipment. Very often here, it's a neck issue or a visual fatigue issue. So although that's not a grossly poor posture, a fixed static posture can be quite difficult to maintain and quite fatiguing. Let me talk about pipettes a little bit. As I said, there are two research papers. And one of the points of putting this slide in is, even with a good design, as you've got on the left, you've still potentially got issues of posture with the wrist. And this is where the training needs to come in as well. You've got things like the multi-pipette, multi-tip pipette, which can reduce the frequency, but of course what tends to happen is you just up the rate. So you're still doing the same frequency. And you've got the arrangement of the workspace. I do see from time to time people arranging their workspace so that they're still tending to hold the arm in a frequent repetitive pipetting operation.
And finally, manual handling, which we mustn't forget, because there is manual handling in the lab. This happens to be just some pictures I've got of handling the rotor out of the centrifuge. Okay, start to think briefly about solutions. Microscopes. Again, this has evolved in recent years, and you do now have microscopes that are either height adjustable, or the eyepiece angle adjusts, and or the length of the eyepiece adjusts. It doesn't, of course, deal with the duration of the viewing. That's a work organisation issue, but the equipment is improving. Pipettes I've probably talked about, but these are closer examples. I don't endorse these, by the way. I'd better say that. But these sort of designs are quite good. The left-hand one, the Eppendorf, is actually operated by all 4 fingers and opposing thumb. And the manual handling. Simple things like a kickstool if it's appropriate, if it's safe, is it safe? And finally, I just want to, as I round up, I wanted to show you this, really because one of the arguments that's sometimes made about health and safety in general, but about ergonomics, is it's just costly and doesn't really produce any benefit. This is what's called ultrafine suture manufacturing, where they're manufacturing, well, it's pretty obvious really, sutures, but specifically for ophthalmic surgery, so they're incredibly fine. The problem was, and the microscope's fine, the problem was that to see the needle, she actually needed to peep around the microscope to make sure it was aligned correctly before she made the join, so to speak. 40% of the staff reported upper limb discomfort, predominantly neck, shoulder, upper back. The company has an in-house ergonomist. They worked with the line managers and with the operators, which is really important, sort of what we call participatory ergonomics. And they came up with this solution, which is to actually use cameras, or a camera, for the operation of viewing the needle. The risk assessment showed they could now work for 6 hours and not 4, which of course delighted the line managers who were now getting more output. But the risk was not increased. That's always the danger. You increase to 6 hours, but you have to keep the risk the same. They managed to really, from their internal risk assessment program, which is really quite a prescriptive program, they were able to show that. Very positive feedback from the staff. They improved the quality, less waste, because they used to get quite a lot of waste going through, because in the QA procedure further down they were finding the needles weren't properly attached. The payback period was 12 months, which is pretty good. But this was checked by chartered accountants. We had a chartered accountant on the team, so that it could stand up to fairly rigid scrutiny by finance directors. So you've got things like net present value and net intervention benefits. Suffice to say, the return on investment was 12 months, which was what I wanted to know. Did this actually produce a real cost benefit? So you've got significantly reduced risk, reduced discomfort, and you've got a good return on investment. Seems like a win-win. So let me summarise. Ergonomic risks in a laboratory setting need to be identified in a systematic manner. They can be quite numerous, but that shouldn't put us off. They can be tackled, and often without significant risk. They can be best tackled within a management system, which is really what health and safety executives are looking for, a managed health and safety system. And in a multidisciplinary approach, the user, getting the users involved, line managers, operational staff, and so on. And don't forget training. I mean training in good ergonomics for the users, because it can be forgotten. And it's doesn't help a common law claim. It really doesn't help. Even if your risk assessments are in place, you see this arise sometimes. The risk assessment will say training needs to be carried out, and then you have not got the proof that the training was ever carried out.